The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the clouds as Robert stepped out of his black sedan at the private airport. He looked like any other traveler that day, wearing comfortable jeans, a simple blue polo shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days. His baseball cap was pulled down low and he carried just a small backpack over his shoulder. Nothing about his appearance screamed wealth or success. What the world didn't know was that Robert owned a tech empire worth billions. He had built his company from scratch in his garage 20 years ago, and now it was one of the biggest names in the industry. But Robert had always been the kind of person who believed in staying humble. He didn't need flashy clothes or expensive jewelry to prove his worth. Today was supposed to be a routine business trip to London. His regular flight crew, the people who had worked for him for years and knew him well, were dealing with a family emergency. So his management company had arranged for a replacement crew at the last minute. Robert didn't mind. He trusted his team to make good decisions. As he walked across the tarmac toward his private jet, Robert felt grateful for how far he had come. Growing up in a small town with a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to pay rent, he never imagined he would one day own his own plane. The aircraft gleamed in the morning light, a beautiful machine that represented years of hard work and determination. The captain greeted him politely at the bottom of the stairs, checking his name off a list. Everything seemed normal as Robert climbed aboard his own aircraft. The interior was exactly as he remembered. Cream-colored leather seats, polished wood panels, and that new carpet smell that still made him smile. But as soon as he stepped into the main cabin, Robert noticed something was off. A woman with short blonde hair and a stern expression was arranging magazines on a side table. She looked up when she heard his footsteps and immediately her face changed. Her friendly flight attendant smile disappeared, replaced by a look of suspicion and annoyance. This was Linda, though Robert didn't know her name yet. She had been working as a flight attendant for 8 years, mostly on commercial flights. This private jet assignment was new territory for her, and she had very specific ideas about what kind of people belonged in first-class cabins. "Excuse me," Linda said, her voice sharp. "I think you might be in the wrong section." Robert looked around, confused. He was standing in his own plane, after all. "I'm sorry, what do you mean?" "This is the first-class area," Linda continued, crossing her arms. "Your seat is probably back there." She pointed toward the rear of the plane, even though there was no economy section on this private aircraft. Robert chuckled softly, thinking there must be some misunderstanding. "Actually, I think I'm in the right place. Let me show you my boarding pass." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the simple piece of paper his assistant had prepared. It clearly showed his name and seat assignment. But Linda barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "Look, I don't know how you got that, but I know who belongs on this flight and who doesn't," she said, her voice getting louder. "This is a very exclusive aircraft and I can't have just anyone wandering around up here." Other passengers were starting to board now, business executives and investors who were joining Robert for various meetings in London. They began to notice the commotion, some stopping to watch while others tried to pretend they weren't listening. Robert felt his stomach drop. He had experienced moments like this before in his life, though not often in recent years. The assumptions, the judgment, based on his appearance, the immediate conclusion that he didn't belong somewhere, it never got easier. "Ma'am, I understand you're just doing your job," Robert said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I assure you, I'm supposed to be here. Maybe we could call the flight operations manager to clear this up." Linda's eyes narrowed. "Don't try to confuse me with fancy words. I've seen people like you before trying to sneak into places where you don't belong. You probably found that boarding pass somewhere or made a fake one." The accusation hung in the air, like a poison cloud. Several passengers were now openly staring, and Robert could feel their eyes on him. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be agreeing with Linda's assessment. A few were even taking out their phones. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," Robert said, his patience wearing thin but his voice still controlled. "I just want to sit down and get to London. Could you please check with someone in charge?" "I am in charge of this cabin," Linda snapped back, "and I'm telling you that you need to move to the back of the plane right now, or I'm going to have to call security." Robert closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. He thought about his mother, who had taught him to always remain dignified even when others were not. He thought about the millions of people who looked like him and faced these situations every day without the resources he had to fight back. "Ma'am, I really don't want this to become a bigger issue than it needs to be," he said. "Let me just call my assistant to sort this out." As Robert reached for his phone, Linda completely misread the situation. In her mind, she saw an aggressive man reaching for something, possibly a weapon. Her training had taught her to watch for threatening behavior, but her judgment was clouded by her assumptions about who Robert was and why he was there. "Don't you dare," she shouted, lunging forward. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Linda's hand came across Robert's face with a sharp crack that echoed through the cabin. The sound was so loud that everyone on the plane turned to look. Robert's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow and he stumbled backward, more from shock than pain. The cabin fell completely silent except for the hum of the aircraft's systems. Robert slowly turned back to face Linda, his cheek red from where she had struck him. His eyes were wide with disbelief, not just from the physical assault but from the sheer audacity of what had just happened. "You need to learn your place," Linda said, her voice shaking with adrenaline and misplaced righteousness. "I won't tolerate any threatening behavior on my aircraft." Her aircraft. The irony was almost too much for Robert to process. He was standing in his own plane, which he had paid for with his own money, being told by someone he had never met before to know his place. The other passengers were completely stunned. Some had their phones out and were recording. Others just stood there with their mouths open. One businessman near the front of the cabin looked like he wanted to say something, but seemed frozen by the awkwardness of the situation. Robert touched his cheek gently, feeling the sting from Linda's slap. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in his chest. This was his plane, his crew, his flight. And yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply because of how he looked and what someone assumed about him. "I want you off this plane right now," Linda continued, emboldened by what she perceived as her successful handling of the situation. "I'm calling the captain and we're having you removed before we even think about taking off." Robert stood there for a moment, looking around at his own aircraft, at the passengers who were supposed to be his guests, at the flight attendant who had just assaulted him in his own property. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. But this wasn't a dream. This was reality, and Robert was about to learn that even with all his success and wealth, some battles were far from over. The slap echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, and for a moment everything seemed frozen. Robert stood there, his hand slowly moving to touch his stinging cheek, while Linda stepped back with a mixture of satisfaction and fear in her eyes. She had crossed a line, and somewhere deep down she knew it. But instead of backing down, Linda decided to double down on her mistake. Her heart was racing, and adrenaline was pumping through her veins. In her mind, she had just defended herself against what she believed was a threatening passenger. She couldn't admit she was wrong now, not in front of all these people. "Captain Williams," she called out loudly, her voice carrying throughout the aircraft. "Captain Williams, I need you. Up here right now." The captain, a man in his 50s with graying hair and 30 years of flying experience, was in the cockpit going through his pre-flight checklist. He heard Linda's urgent call and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. In all his years of flying, he had rarely heard such panic in a flight attendant's voice. He quickly made his way to the cabin, followed by his co-pilot, a younger man named Tom who looked concerned. When they arrived, they found a scene that neither of them had expected. Robert was standing near the front of the cabin, his cheek visibly red, while Linda stood a few feet away, her chest heaving with rapid breaths. "What's going on here?" "Captain," Williams asked, looking between Robert and Linda. Linda immediately launched into her version of events, speaking quickly and dramatically. "This man forced his way into first class and refused to move when I asked him to. When I tried to check his identification, he became aggressive and threatened me. I had to defend myself." Robert opened his mouth to speak, but Linda cut him off. He was reaching for something in his pocket, Captain. I thought he might have a weapon. I was just protecting the other passengers and myself. The captain looked at Robert with new suspicion. Flight safety was his #1 priority, and if there was even a chance that Robert posed a threat, he had to take it seriously. The fact that Linda was clearly shaken only added weight to her story in his mind. "Is this true?" Captain Williams asked Robert directly. "No, sir, it's not," Robert replied calmly, though his voice carried the strain of someone trying very hard to maintain composure. "I was simply trying to take my assigned seat when this lady became hostile. I was reaching for my phone to call my assistant to clear up what I thought was a simple misunderstanding." "He's lying," Linda interrupted again. "Look at him, Captain. Does he look like someone who belongs in first class on a private jet? He's probably using a fake boarding pass or something." Several passengers were now listening intently to every word. Among them was a young businessman named Kevin who had been seated just a few rows away when the incident occurred. Kevin had seen the entire thing unfold, and he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what he was witnessing. Kevin was a successful lawyer who had dealt with his fair share of discrimination cases. He recognized the signs immediately, the assumptions, the profiling, the way Linda had treated Robert from the moment he stepped on board. But Kevin also knew that speaking up in situations like this could be complicated and risky. Captain Williams looked at Robert's boarding pass, which seemed legitimate enough, but Linda's distress was convincing. In situations like this, crew members typically sided with each other. It was part of the unwritten code of aviation. Trust your team, especially when passenger safety might be at stake. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the aircraft while we sort this out," the captain said to Robert. "This is just a precautionary measure until we can verify everything." Robert felt his heart sink. "Captain, I understand your concern for safety, but I assure you I'm not a threat to anyone. I just want to get to London for my business meetings." "That's what they all say," Linda muttered under her breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. The co-pilot, Tom, was studying the situation carefully. Something didn't feel right to him. He had been flying for 10 years and had developed a good instinct for reading people. Robert didn't carry himself like someone who was trying to cause trouble. His clothes might be casual, but his speech was educated, his manner respectful, despite being obviously upset. "Maybe we should call the flight operations office," Tom suggested, quietly to the captain. "They can verify the passenger manifest." Linda's eyes flashed with annoyance. "We don't have time for all that. We have a schedule to keep, and I won't feel safe taking off with this man on board." By now, more passengers had boarded and were witnessing the confrontation. Some were taking out their phones not just to record, but to share what they were seeing on social media. The age of instant communication meant that incidents like this could go viral within minutes. Kevin, the lawyer, finally decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood up from his seat and approached the group. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I was sitting right here when this whole thing started, and I have to say, this gentleman didn't do anything threatening. He was very calm and respectful the entire time." Linda spun around to face Kevin. "And who are you? Another friend of his?" "I'm just a passenger who saw what really happened," Kevin replied firmly. "This man was assaulted for no reason other than trying to sit in his assigned seat." "That's not what happened," Linda insisted, but her voice was starting to crack slightly. Having a witness contradict her story was not part of her plan. Captain Williams was now in a difficult position. He had his flight attendant claiming one thing and a passenger witness saying another. The smart thing to do would be to get everyone off the plane and sort it out on the ground. But that would mean significant delays and unhappy passengers. "Look," the captain said, trying to find a middle ground. "Why don't we just call airport security and let them handle this? They can verify everyone's identity and we can get to the bottom of this quickly." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. Airport security meant more humiliation, more assumptions, more time trying to prove he belonged somewhere he actually owned. But he also realized that fighting it at this point would only make him look more suspicious. "Fine," Robert said quietly. "Call security, but I want to make it clear that I have not threatened anyone or done anything wrong." Linda seemed pleased with this development. In her mind, getting security involved would prove she was right. Airport. Security would take one look at Robert and immediately side with her. She had convinced herself that she was the victim in this situation. As they waited for security to arrive, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other passengers were whispering among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. A few business executives near the back of the plane were checking their watches, worried about their tight schedules in London. Kevin remained standing, keeping his phone ready to record if things got worse. He had already sent a quick text to his wife describing what he was witnessing. Something about this whole situation felt deeply wrong to him, and he was determined to make sure the truth came out. Robert stood quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He thought about all the times his mother had told him to hold his head high, no matter what others might think or say. She had faced her own share of discrimination working as a housekeeper for wealthy families, and she had taught him that true strength came from maintaining your character, even when others lost theirs. Little did anyone know that the next few minutes would change everything, as the truth was about to come out in the most dramatic way possible. The airport security team arrived 15 minutes later, their heavy boots echoing on the aircraft's metal steps. 2 officers in dark uniforms climbed aboard. Officer Martinez, a veteran with 20 years of experience, and Officer Chen, a younger woman who had joined the force just 2 years ago. Officer Martinez took one look at the scene and immediately assessed the situation. He saw Robert standing calmly near the front of the cabin, Linda wringing her hands nervously, and several passengers with their phones out recording everything. This was exactly the kind of incident that could explode on social media if not handled properly. "All right, what's the situation here?" Officer Martinez asked, pulling out his notepad. Linda jumped at the chance to tell her story first. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man forced his way into first class, and when I asked him to move, he became violent and threatening. I had to defend myself when he reached for something in his pocket." She pointed dramatically at Robert, her voice rising with each word. "He doesn't belong on this flight. I mean, just look at him. This is a private jet for business executives, not—" She paused, realizing she was about to say something that would get her in serious trouble. Officer Chen raised an eyebrow. "Not what, ma'am?" Linda stumbled over her words. Not people who can't afford it. I mean, people without proper tickets." Robert had remained silent during Linda's explanation, but now he stepped forward. "Officers, I'd like to show you my identification and boarding documents. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here." He slowly reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, several credit cards, and his boarding pass. Officer Martinez examined them carefully, noting that everything appeared to be legitimate. The name on the boarding pass matched the ID perfectly. "Robert Thompson," Officer Martinez read aloud. "Says here you're in seat 2A. "That's correct," Robert replied calmly. "That's exactly where I was trying to sit when this incident began." Officer Chen was studying the boarding pass more closely. Something about it looked different from typical commercial airline tickets. "This doesn't look like a regular airline ticket," she observed. "That's because this is a private aircraft," Robert explained. "The boarding pass is issued by the flight management company." Linda scoffed loudly. "He's obviously lying. Probably got that fake ID made at some shop downtown." "Officers, you can't seriously believe that someone like him owns a private jet." Kevin, the lawyer who had witnessed everything, couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stood up and approached the group. "Officers, I saw this entire incident from the beginning. This gentleman was completely respectful and did nothing threatening whatsoever. The flight attendant struck him without any provocation." "And who are you?" Officer Martinez asked. "Kevin Walsh, attorney with Morrison and Associates," Kevin replied, handing over his business card. "I was seated right there and recorded part of what happened on my phone." Officer Chen's eyes lit up. "You have video evidence?" "I do," Kevin confirmed. "And what I recorded clearly shows that this man was assaulted for simply trying to sit in his assigned seat." Linda's face was starting to turn pale. The presence of video evidence was not something she had counted on. He's probably working with that guy, she said desperately. They probably planned this whole thing together. Officer Martinez was getting tired of Linda's increasingly wild accusations. In his experience, people who kept changing their story usually weren't telling the truth. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down and let us do our job." Meanwhile, Kevin had pulled out his phone and was showing the officers the video he had taken. The footage clearly showed Linda becoming aggressive with Robert, culminating in her striking him across the face. There was no evidence of Robert being threatening in any way. "This is very interesting," Officer Chen said after watching the video. "Mr. Thompson, you said this is a private aircraft. Do you happen to know who owns it?" Robert took a deep breath. He had been hoping to avoid this moment, but it was clear that the truth was going to come out one way or another. "Yes, I do know who owns it." "And who would that be?" Officer Martinez asked. "I do," Robert said quietly. "I own this aircraft." The cabin fell completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioning system. Linda's mouth dropped open, Captain Williams looked confused, and several passengers started whispering among themselves. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Officer Chen asked, thinking she had misheard. "I said I own this aircraft," Robert repeated, louder this time. "This is my plane. I bought it 3 years ago through Thompson Industries, which is my company." Linda let out a harsh laugh. "That's ridiculous. You expect us to believe that you, dressed like that, own a multi-million-dollar aircraft? Come on, officers. He's obviously desperate and making up stories." But Officer Martinez was already on his radio, calling dispatch to run a check on the aircraft's registration. Within minutes, his radio crackled back with information that made everyone in the cabin freeze. "Aircraft registration, November 772 Alpha Tango. Is registered to Thompson Industries, LLC. Owner listed as Robert J. Thompson." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face went from pale to completely white. Captain Williams looked like he had seen a ghost. Even some of the passengers who had been recording stopped to stare in disbelief. Officer Chen looked at Robert with new respect. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to need to verify this with some additional documentation if you don't mind." "Of course," Robert replied, pulling out his phone. "Let me call my assistant. She can provide whatever verification you need." As Robert dialed his phone, Linda was frantically trying to process what was happening. If this man really owned the plane, then she had just assaulted her ultimate boss. Not only that, she had done it in front of witnesses and cameras. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she whispered to Captain Williams. "He can't really own this plane. Look at how he's dressed." Captain Williams was starting to realize the magnitude of the situation. He had been flying for corporate clients for years, and he knew that many extremely wealthy people dressed very casually. Some of the richest people he had ever flown preferred jeans and t-shirts to expensive suits. Robert's phone call connected, and he spoke quietly for a moment before handing the phone to Officer Martinez. "This is Janet, my executive assistant. She can provide you with all the documentation you need." Officer Martinez spoke with Janet for several minutes, asking for specific details about the aircraft, the flight plan, and Robert's identity. Everything checked out perfectly. Janet even offered to email additional documentation to prove Robert's ownership of both the plane and the company. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Martinez said after ending the call, "I owe you an apology. It's clear that you are indeed the owner of this aircraft and that you were assaulted without cause." He turned to Linda, his expression stern. "Ma'am, based on the video evidence and the testimony of witnesses, it appears that you struck this gentleman without any justification. That constitutes assault under state law." Linda's legs nearly gave out beneath her. But I was just doing my job. I thought he was trying to cause trouble. How was I supposed to know?" "You were supposed to treat all passengers with respect and dignity," Kevin interjected, "regardless of how they were dressed or what you assumed about them." Robert, who had been quiet during the officer's investigation, finally spoke up. "Officers, while I appreciate you getting to the truth, I want to make something clear. This isn't just about me being the owner of this aircraft. What happened here would have been wrong regardless of who I was or what I owned." His words carried a weight that made everyone in the cabin think deeply about what had just occurred. Here was a man who had been humiliated and assaulted, who could have used his power to destroy the people responsible, and instead he was talking about basic human dignity. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Thompson," Officer Chen agreed. "No passenger should be treated the way you were treated today." Linda was now crying, the full impact of her actions finally hitting her. She had not only committed assault, but she had done it based on nothing more than her own prejudices and assumptions. The video evidence meant there was no way to deny what had happened. The other passengers were beginning to understand the gravity of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding between a passenger and crew member. This was a clear case of discrimination that had escalated to violence, and it had all been captured on camera. As word began to spread through social media about what had happened, the incident was already starting to gain attention online. Kevin's video, along with recordings from other passengers, were being shared and viewed by thousands of people. The truth was finally out, but the consequences of Linda's actions were just beginning to unfold. Within 2 hours of Kevin posting his video online, the internet had exploded. The footage of Linda striking Robert while he stood calmly trying to explain his situation had been shared thousands of times across every social media platform imaginable. The hashtag Tasha private jet incident was trending worldwide, and news outlets were already picking up the story. Robert sat in the airport's VIP lounge, still trying to process everything that had happened. His cheek no longer stung from Linda's slap, but the emotional impact was far deeper than any physical pain. He had built his company from nothing, earned respect in the business world, and achieved more success than he had ever dreamed possible as a kid. Yet in a matter of minutes, all of that had meant nothing to someone who looked at him and saw only what she expected to see. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, business partners, and friends who had seen the news. His executive assistant Janet had flown into crisis management mode, fielding calls and trying to control the narrative. But Robert knew this story was too big to control now. Meanwhile, Linda sat in a small security office at the airport, her career crumbling around her. The airline company had already called to inform her that she was suspended pending a full investigation. Her supervisor, Mr. Peterson, had been apologetic, but firm on the phone. "Linda, I've seen the video like everyone else," he had said. "What you did was completely unacceptable. We've built our reputation on treating all passengers with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or how they look." Linda tried to explain herself, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I thought I was protecting the other passengers. I didn't think." "That's exactly the problem," Mr. Peterson had interrupted. "You didn't think. You made assumptions based on someone's appearance and then you assaulted them. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to our company's reputation?" The answer was becoming clear as social media continued to buzz with outrage. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination, talking about times they had been judged unfairly based on their appearance. The incident had touched a nerve that went far beyond just one flight attendant's poor judgment. Kevin, the lawyer who had witnessed everything, was being interviewed by a local news station via phone. He had become an overnight hero for speaking up and recording the incident. "What struck me most was how calm and dignified Mr. Thompson remained throughout the entire ordeal," Kevin told the reporter. "He never raised his voice, never became aggressive even after being physically assaulted. He handled it with more grace than I think most people would have." The reporter asked Kevin what message he hoped people would take from the incident. "I think it shows how important it is to speak up when we see injustice happening," Kevin replied. "If I hadn't recorded what happened and testified about what I saw, this story might have been very different. We all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right." Back at the airport, Robert finally decided to leave the VIP lounge and head home. His London meetings would have to be rescheduled. As he walked through the terminal, several people recognized him from the videos that were now circulating online. Some approached him to express their support, while others simply nodded respectfully as he passed. One elderly gentleman, an African-American man with gray hair and kind eyes, stopped Robert near the exit. "Son, the man said quietly. "I've been watching the news about what happened to you today. I want you to know that what you're going through, a lot of us have been through it too, but not all of us had cameras recording when it happened to us." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for saying that, sir. It means more than you know." "What you do next matters," the elderly man continued. "You've got the power and resources to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to the next person. Don't waste that opportunity." Those words stayed with Robert as he drove home to his house in the hills overlooking the city. He had always known that his success came with responsibility, but he had never felt it as acutely as he did now. At home, Robert found his mother waiting for him. Dorothy Thompson was 72 years old and had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families for most of her life. She had experienced her own share of discrimination and had taught her son to always maintain his dignity no matter how others treated him. "I saw the news, baby," she said, wrapping her son in a warm hug. "Are you okay?" Robert hugged his mother, tightly, finally allowing himself to feel the full emotional impact of the day. "I don't know, Mom. I thought I had left all of this behind. I thought success would protect me from people like her." Dorothy pulled back and looked her son in the eyes. "Success doesn't change the color of your skin, Robert, and it doesn't change some people's hearts. But what it does give you is a platform to speak for those who don't have a voice." They sat together in Robert's living room, watching as news coverage of the incident continued to dominate the airwaves. Civil rights leaders were being interviewed, discussing the broader implications of what had happened. Business leaders were calling for better diversity training in the service industry. Linda, meanwhile, was at home in her small apartment, watching the same news coverage with growing horror. She saw herself being described as a symbol of everything wrong with racial profiling and discrimination. Her phone had been ringing non-stop with calls from reporters wanting her side of the story, but she was too ashamed to answer. Her sister called from across the country, having seen the news. "Linda, what were you thinking? How could you do something like that?" "I don't know," Linda sobbed into the phone. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought he was trying to cause trouble. I've seen people try to sneak into first class before." "But you hit him, Linda. You actually hit the man, and he turned out to be the owner of the plane." The reality of her situation was sinking in deeper with every passing hour. Linda realized that she hadn't just lost her job. She had potentially ruined her entire career. Who would want to hire a flight attendant who had been caught on video assaulting a passenger? The airline company was already distancing itself from her actions. They released a statement saying that Linda's behavior was completely contrary to their values and that they were conducting a thorough review of their hiring and training practices. Robert's company, Thompson Industries, was also issuing statements. His board of directors had called an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the situation. Some wanted to pursue legal action against Linda and the airline, while others suggested focusing on turning the incident into an opportunity for positive change. Robert himself was torn about what to do next. Part of him wanted justice, and not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated the way he was treated that day. Another part of him wanted to move on and try to forget the whole thing had ever happened. As the evening news aired, Robert's story was the lead story on every major network. The incident had become a national conversation about race, class, and the assumptions people make about others based on their appearance. Civil rights attorney Patricia Williams was interviewed on the evening news, putting the incident in broader context. "What happened to Mr. Thompson happens to people of color every day in this country," she said. "The only difference is that most of those incidents don't get recorded, and most of the victims don't have the resources to fight back. This case shines a light on a problem that has been in the shadows for too long." The reporter asked what she thought should happen next. "This is an opportunity for real change," Patricia replied. "Not just punishment for one person's bad behavior, but systemic changes in how service industry workers are trained and how companies handle discrimination complaints." As Robert watched the interview, he began to realize that the elderly man at the airport had been right. What he did next would matter not just for him, but for countless others who had faced similar situations without cameras rolling or social media to amplify their voices. The incident had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were before. 3 weeks after the incident, Robert stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in downtown Los Angeles, looking out at a room filled with reporters, civil rights leaders, business executives, and airline industry officials. The bright camera, lights felt warm on his face as he prepared to make the most important announcement of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert began, his voice steady and confident. "3 weeks ago, I experienced something that no person should ever have to endure. I was judged, humiliated, and physically assaulted based solely on the color of my skin and someone's assumptions about who I was supposed to be." The room was completely silent, hanging on every word. Robert had spent weeks thinking about this moment, planning exactly what he wanted to say and how he wanted to use this platform. "But today I'm not here to dwell on what happened to me," he continued. "I'm here to announce something that will help ensure it doesn't happen to others. Today, I'm launching the Equal Skies Foundation, dedicated to eliminating discrimination in travel and transportation industries." The applause was thunderous. Robert had committed $50 million of his own money to the foundation, which would provide diversity training, fund legal support for discrimination victims, and work with companies to implement better policies. The foundation will also establish the Kevin Walsh Courage Award, Robert announced, nodding to the lawyer sitting in the front row. "Recognizing individuals who speak up when they witness injustice, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable to do so." Kevin wiped tears from his eyes as the crowd applauded. His decision to record the incident and testify on Robert's behalf had made him a symbol of standing up for what's right. Since the incident, Kevin had received dozens of job offers from law firms wanting to associate with his integrity. Behind the scenes, the weeks following the incident had been a whirlwind for everyone involved. Robert had met with civil rights leaders, business executives, and even government officials about ways to address systemic discrimination. What had started as a horrible personal experience was transforming into a movement for change. Linda's life had taken a very different path. After being terminated from her job, she had spent weeks in her apartment, afraid to go out because people recognized her from the viral video. Her family had been supportive, but she knew she had to face the consequences of her actions. 2 weeks. After the incident, Linda had made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called Robert's office and asked if she could speak with him personally. After several days of back and forth with his security team and lawyers, Robert agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop downtown. Linda walked into the coffee shop wearing dark sunglasses and a baseball cap, hoping not to be recognized. When she saw Robert sitting at a corner table, her hands began to shake. This was the man she had struck, the man she had humiliated, the man whose dignity she had tried to strip away with her actions. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, as she approached the table, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Robert gestured for her to sit down. He had spent a lot of time thinking about this meeting, wondering what Linda might want to say and how he should respond. "I know sorry isn't enough," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that what I did was wrong on every level. I've been going to counseling, trying to understand how I could have acted that way." Robert listened without interrupting, studying Linda's face as she spoke. He could see genuine remorse there, not just regret about getting caught or losing her job, but real understanding of the harm she had caused. "I grew up in a small town where people like you, where there wasn't much diversity," Linda continued, struggling to find the right words. "I realize now that I had ideas in my head about people that were completely wrong. Ideas I didn't even know I had until that day." "What do you want from this meeting?" Robert asked gently. Linda took a deep breath. "I want to make this right. Somehow. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to help fix the problem I was part of. I've been thinking about what I could do." She pulled out a folder from her purse and placed it on the table. "I've written down every detail I can remember about my training, about the culture at the airline, about the attitudes I encountered. I want to help you and your foundation understand how people like me are created. so you can prevent it from happening again." Robert was genuinely surprised. He had expected Linda to ask for forgiveness or try to minimize her actions. Instead, she was offering to help expose the systemic problems that had contributed to her behavior. "I'm also willing to speak publicly about what I did and why it was wrong," Linda added. "I know people hate me right now, and I deserve that. But if my story can help train other people to recognize their own biases, then maybe something good can come from this." Over the next hour, Linda and Robert had the most honest conversation either of them had ever had about race, privilege, and the unconscious biases that shape how people see each other. It was uncomfortable and emotional, but it was also productive. When Robert announced Linda's cooperation with the foundation at his press conference, it shocked many people. Some criticized him for giving her a platform, while others praised his willingness to work with someone who had wronged him if it meant creating positive change. "Linda Wilson has agreed to work with our foundation to help develop training programs that address unconscious bias," Robert announced. "She will share her story not to excuse her actions, but to help others recognize these dangerous thought patterns in themselves before they lead to harmful behavior." Linda herself appeared at the press conference, though she was visibly nervous, standing at the podium. "3 weeks ago I made the worst mistake of my life," she said, her voice shaking. "I let my unconscious biases turn me into someone I never thought I was, someone who could hurt another human being simply because of how they looked." The room was silent as Linda continued. "I'm here today because Mr. Thompson has given me an opportunity I don't deserve, the chance to help prevent others from making the same mistakes I made. I will spend the rest of my life working to undo the harm I've caused." The press conference made headlines around the world. The image of Linda and Robert standing together on stage became a powerful symbol of reconciliation and the possibility of change even in the most difficult circumstances. Kevin, meanwhile, had quit his job at the law firm to become the foundation's first director of advocacy. His experience witnessing and documenting the incident had given him a new purpose in life. "What I learned that day is that being a bystander isn't enough," Kevin told reporters. "When we see injustice happening, we have a responsibility to act. Not everyone has to be a hero, but everyone can choose to do the right thing." The airline industry began implementing sweeping changes. Major airlines adopted new training programs developed by the Equal Skies Foundation. The programs focused not just on policy and procedure, but on examining unconscious bias and treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Captain Williams, the pilot from that day, became one of the foundation's biggest supporters within the aviation industry. He admitted that he had made assumptions about Robert based on Linda's account and his own unconscious biases. "I've been flying for 30 years, and I thought I was above this kind of thinking," Captain Williams said during a foundation training session. "But when I really examined my behavior that day, I realized I was part of the problem too. We all have to do better." 6 months after the incident, Robert received a letter from a young black woman named Angela who worked as a flight attendant for a major airline. She wrote about how the foundation's training had helped her recognize bias from both colleagues and passengers, and how Robert's response to his own situation had inspired her to speak up about discrimination she witnessed at work. "Your story gave me courage," Angela wrote. "But more than that, your response showed me that we can turn our worst experiences into opportunities to help others. Thank you for not letting anger and revenge define your response. Thank you for choosing to build something better instead." Robert kept that letter on his desk as a reminder of why the foundation's work mattered. The incident on his plane had been painful and humiliating, but it had also opened doors to create change that went far beyond his personal experience. As he looked back on everything that had happened, Robert realized that the elderly man at the airport had been right. What he did next had mattered, not just for him, but for countless others who would benefit from the changes that grew out of one terrible day that became a catalyst for something much bigger and more important than anyone could have imagined.